Hello, folks. I am excited to welcome you to the kind of cap discussion of the Dream Big virtual conference that we've been having today. We're going to change gears in a really exciting way for the topic that we have here. I'm really excited to introduce you folks to Kerrin Mitchell of Fluxx. Kerrin is a fantastic person, a fantastic partner, somebody who I love working with, and I think after a day that we are pre-recording this, but we're all living the same, quote unquote new normal, and so we're going to try to kind of do a little bit of a palate cleanse actually, and shift from living in this moment into creating momentum, and I think there's no better person to talk to about that than Kerrin. So Kerrin, welcome to the conference.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
We're going to have a nice organic conversation. Why don't you tell the crowd who's watching this now and later a little bit about yourself, and kind of we'll take it from there.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kerrin. I am one of the co-founders of Fluxx and the Chief Development Officer here. We started Fluxx, I don't know, a good 10 years ago. So it's been my passion, my everything for the last while, but a journey that started definitely before Fluxx. I had been involved in foundations. On the kind of pro bono side, I had done a lot of work in my previous role in finance, working with our local foundation at the previous company I was at. So I'd sort of always been ingratiated into it, had always been a passion of mine, thrilled to be able to now be in an industry that is doing something really incredible. And what I find for myself, who comes from sort of the enterprise background in finance and all big structures, and then moving into foundation spaces, I get a blend the two really nicely, work with large organizations, work with important people that are trying to change the world, but also ground it in places around, business structures and organizational kind of capabilities that I'm familiar with. So it's a lovely intersection, and I'm grateful for it every day, especially these days, that what we do is something that is actually relevant in the world. It means a lot to me. But at Fluxx, we're a grant management company, exclusively focused on the social sector. Our platform offerings are actually solely constructed by and for the grant making world. So our intention really is to come forward, build a structure to bring the greatest possible social and economic impact. We partner with Neon, obviously, on the grant making side, with a focus around helping foundations identify, serve, invest, track the grantees and the good work and impact that those grantees are making in their communities. So our platform is sort of the end-to-end structure for grant making. Over the last decade or so, we've grown to about 275 plus organizations on the Fluxx platform, serving well over 100,000 nonprofits themselves. I think the foundations we have represent over $175 billion in assets. So we are humbled to be a part of that philanthropic community. We look to our technology and to technology in general to help build cohesive solutions to meet the needs of that group. And while I know technology may not solve world hunger or COVID, it certainly plays a role in solving the human problems that get in the way of solving those bigger issues. So we see our role as the enablement, the framework, the way to move things forward and approach that, as with any initiative or disaster or whatever it be, with that in mind. So, it's Fluxx and me.
And you. And we've had a lot of conversations because in terms of these types of things, because, you have that background, very, very deep background that I've appreciated learning so much in a really accelerated way, and seeing the intersections between what kind of we oversee on the individual giving side, because we've both talked extensively that it's like all these pieces, if they're working in parallel, are not as efficient. And so, especially given the crowd of folks watching this who run a giving event, right? And it might be, actually, right. Kerrin, I don't know if we talked about this, but one of the really exciting things that came out of Giving Tuesday now being announced, for instance, is the United Way of Dallas and the Communities of Texas Foundation and the Dallas Cowboys are all collaborating on a big giving event. But what they also did is they got all the community foundations and other foundations to agree to one unified COVID relief grant form too. So that's the type of stuff that I want us to kind of start to unpack. I think just Dallas has been really kind of nailing their response across the board. But, you know, what are you seeing happening now that you think is going to stick, or you hope sticks, when it comes to just digital philanthropy, when it comes to especially the foundation space and all these types of things?
I mean, it's super interesting. It's philanthropy, yes, but it's like it's every industry. And I mean, if you're thinking about even healthcare right now, ER visits are being conducted virtually. And why has that not been done earlier? I mean, I have doctor friends asking the same question the same way we would, which is why haven't we been thinking about and moving as a collective? And I think, you know, in the past, a common misconception of not foundations, but in general, as humans, it's a bit myopic. It's a hub. I'm here in the hub, and here's my spoke. And your spoke might be nonprofit ABC, a foundation here, a community foundation there, and it's all in your view. And your ability to impact or be aware of their efforts is as simple as you communicating with them and creating that hub and spoke network. And so, really good networkers, really good structures in place for communications help to sort of create that. And what I think that technology unveils, and what COVID, bless its heart, like unveils, is the need to be able to stretch beyond the hub and spoke and into that many-to-many relationship. So that concept of it's connected, it's there, but more importantly to foundations, to nonprofits, to our ecosystem in this philanthropic social sector, is that it is non-competing. So unlike almost every other economy in the world that operates on a competing, you know, game economy, this is a cooperative game. This is the stuff you read about in your economic books, and you think like, where's a cooperative economy out there? It's philanthropy. It's the betterment of the whole through the betterment of the you know, each individual contributing to that upper you know, limit and push beyond.
It was fascinating. So I had a recent discussion that we had with a few members of our ecosystem on the consultant side, individual consultants, a digital consultant, and a really good direct mail kind of, you know, on the ground type stuff. And I kind of talked about that. I talked about, you know, I do see us moving toward a collaboration, and one of the consultants, the direct mail and traditional fundraising kind of background, back end structure, CRM, all this great stuff. I mean, T. Clay Buck, he pushed on me on this, and it's been bothering me because he says, you know, you don't hear this type of talk when it comes to the 3 nail salons, and they all are in one block of each other, and nobody's saying, why aren't you collaborating with each other? And I think at the time, I don't think I actually gave a great answer, but I think what I did try to focus in on is that we are inherently a different structure and a different point of our we're not there to provide that kind of individualized service, right? And so when you hear statements like that, when you hear that type of thing, what's your reaction? What's your kind of take on that type of?
Well, I think the reaction is that the collective is, while it is the idea of a collective is sort of this democratic kind of concept of how do we pull together voices at the same level, infuse them with each other's knowledge, and create a better world together. I mean, I think foundations in that lens, and the nail salon, you know, one of them will be the rate determining or rate limiting step in moving forward. Somebody will have a structure, a nuance, a uniqueness that needs to be fulfilled, and that balance, that art form of the unique need versus the collective. There is an element of sacrifice, and for sure an art form involved in that. And I think the structure, when I think of it applied to where we are as an industry, is that we have to change the building blocks to be able to let people feel like they have that control. And I think tools like Neon or Fluxx and others that can be highly configured to adopt for the individual are there, but you have to be able to have the constructs embedded within. I think that's where you look at, again, how that comes together. And I think it's high-level trends and traction and projects around industry initiatives, common taxonomies, common apps, you know, affiliation groups, hyper local work. It has to come at that grassroots, but then you have to have a technology that permits a little bit of stretch and grow for each particular group because they're going to come at it with different lenses. Now, to be clear, I don't say that foundations are the rate limiting step. They are rate determining in many ways because they are oftentimes the ones holding the larger checks than the individuals, which makes them, the point at which people will jump a little higher to make sure that they get what they need to build in that structure and to be able to be a recipient of that larger fund. So I think to that degree, it is incumbent on foundations to rethink their role and transform that process. And I have a couple ideas kind of on what that would look like, but I think that's the big thing, is that realistically the collective does have a little bit of weighting. Some are going to be bigger than others. Some are going to have a little bit more power. And it's not that I'm saying give up power, but I'm saying recognize where that exists and then build and connect essentially through that idea of how do you make things, how do you improve capacity, how do you make it easier, how do you service things better for the collective, not just for your own purposes.
And on what's a really great example, especially for this crowd, is I think that giving events represent that in a really kind of easy to digest way.
Right.
Because think about it, you have one dedicated platform that is brought to you by a host, but then hundreds of individual grassroots organizations are joining that and then activating their own networks to come to one space. Kind of, there's a little bit of checking their ego of like, well, why don't I just send them to my website? It's like, well, you're not going to be as powerful in mobilizing community action if you splinter. And so I think that's a nice way on that side.
Of real time, right? I mean, that's the thing too. And again, highlighting COVID as a mobilization of how do we start to, again, align against a common initiative in a real time way that connects people to what they're doing, where opportunities are, where, need and funds exist. You're starting to see it in the form of, actually Chicago Community Trust is doing something extraordinary right now, using a series of basically structures where they have mobilized over $20 million. And in that, what they basically said is, we will grant you this money. And in return, what we want to be able to do is have you post to an impact wall. And they're using actually a free product that we have in Fluxx that is called Grant Seeker. And it's really interesting because it wasn't the use case we hadn't intended it to be, but that is the way of technology. Oftentimes those little come in and you're like, oh, that's how you want to use that. Fantastic. But the interesting part about it is they've come in and created a way for basically people to register the impact of the various things they're doing, almost in Twitter-like feeds, but with rich media and things of that nature. And 100 grantees now showed up and are a part of that discussion. And so now the state of Illinois is even considering, well, how do we do that at a state level? Yeah. And I think that's the part you start to realize, that these grassroots level movements and the ability where all of a sudden people could see things for the first time ever, they can't unsee the fact that now they're all doing these great things alike. So how do we keep that, again, moment going into momentum, to use your kind of term there? How do we keep that momentum there? How do we enable that? How do we as technologists look at that and say, oh, that's how you're using our tool? That's fantastic. We need to think through, what does that mean for us to meet you where you're doing that? And what does that mean for us to build scale in those capacities? And what do you need us to be thinking of? And I think that's the important part, that oftentimes people technologies either trying to guide it and putting things too far out and saying, this is the vision for where things are going. And you're like, you are 5 years ahead of us and that's not going to work. Or we're not a part of a conversation and then we can't help you get to where you need. And I think right now, with everyone coming in, you're seeing this wonderful collective build.
Yeah, and I think that even going back to the kind of the power of the individual versus the collective when it comes to all these different initiatives, the reality is that in order to move the needle, you have to address things quickly. You have to address things in a way that's scalable, and you have to address things in a way that is replicable as well. And if you do that through splintered nail salons then that have their own things, then that's just, it's not going to be as impactful and as efficient and as useful. And and even just the idea of coming together around like simple things of data, right? Just coming together and saying like, we're going to all use the same type of platform or structure, or even the fields just coming up and saying like, let's say this, or those are important things. And I think a lot of organizations, this is a perfect time for them to think about the data that's happening in the back end too, and how they're managing that and what they're going to do with that, because we live in a time of extraordinary access to data, but there's so much waste there too. Because
there really is.
People where to funnel it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really interesting, I mean, there's a couple things you touched on that are interesting. One is, what will it really take to transform the industry? And I think you're right. It's mobilizing around the focal point. It's not that I have a nail salon, it's the experience.
Not to mess with you, Clay. I know you might see this later, but
we'll come up with a new one. But the idea that foundations are now mobilizing around a new focal point of the grantee experience is a really important thing. Questions about how to improve capacity, again, make it easier, service things are everywhere. Additional questions about governance. You mentioned, what's actually necessary for us to get our job done? What are we being reported at? Who should own the data? Huge question. It's something where as technologists, you're like, oh, well, we want to own the data because, we have this great thing and then we have the marketplace and we can do all this good stuff with. But the reality is kind of like the grantees own their own data and how and where they give it and how that works. Like, it's really rethinking how we all look at this information. And you're starting to see the rise of things like data trust, groups like Bright Hive doing incredible work, bringing forward the concept of how do we come to terms, govern, build integrity, and share data at the same time, and make sure that the ownership sits with the people that are, the foundations and the grantees doing that. I think it's a big deal. How do you govern that? So the questions that are coming forward, and in fact, all of it's not terribly technical in its leveling, but they're concepts about building the groundwork. And I think what you're seeing, to your final point, is that for the first time in ever, and I know everyone always joked about the Common App, like, yeah, sure, that'll work. It never, in theory, it was always like a joke at drinks during like foundation events. But for the first time ever, we're seeing momentum on it. And I think there's a reason, because there's that tectonic shift of understanding the collective. Can this be driven by the foundations, or who should be driving it? Can it be structured as an open tech play? What would it work? Why would it not work? So there's a lot of momentum, and there's actually discrete projects being set up by huge players like MacArthur and others saying, we can do this as a group. And even if you need your permutations to exist outside of it, why would we ever overburden our grantees to produce a body of work in myopic little looks and feels when we know that the bulk of it is curated from this with obviously appendages elsewhere? So starting to think that through has become a big part. And even in our implementations of Fluxx, people asking about data trust, asking about Common App, asking about, how do we start to do things in a community manner? How do we make sure that it's something that can be pulled out using APIs and in a structure that makes sense to the other players that are part of it? And, asking us as Fluxx, can you play in a cross-tech platform? Play where we have all your various competitors all at the table trying to do the right thing. And the truth is, absolutely, we have to. Yeah. So I think that's the exciting part that I look at for the industry that's different than any other time. And the transformation of process, common apps, governance is a huge part of that.
I think this is a key time for organizations to step back. And it doesn't matter if you're a foundation, an individual nonprofit, to just step back and say, I think that now is the time to finally kill the phrase, we've always done it that way.
Right.
And we're seeing this, if you follow Vuli on Twitter, Nonprofit AF, he's been actually hashtagging like crappy funder process.
Calling some people out, my goodness.
He's calling people out, and he's doing it because it's like, why are you forcing people to like go mail 12 copies? Why are you forcing people to, get a notary, like a physical notary on a form right now? Like these are things that need to be thrown away, and it's not even an access thing. I mean, the technology is affordable. The technology is easily implementable. Right. It's about now just finally raising the bar in terms of equity and access, but then I think the onus, though, Kerrin, on our end is, as the technology platforms, to withhold and to uphold rather that trust. I do love the fact that you're talking about that, because ironically we're using Zoom to record this, and there's so many companies that they just kind of, I would argue that the vast majority of privacy issues or things like that are not born out of outright malice, but because they just didn't bother to think about it. Or they copied somebody else's terms of service.
Right.
because they were just trying to spin it up real quick.
Right.
Or a lawyer designed it based off of a template that they saw from somebody else. And when it comes to that type of stuff, and
Right.
people aren't stepping back and thinking
Yeah.
these ramifications through on
Putting
all of
forethought
these different
into
things.
it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the reality of this is that, like, if we talk about putting forethought into this, building these taxonomies, structures, things like that, you know, and we get to a point where we can build an organizational resilience for whether it be through technology upgrades, through process, through legal, whatever it be. I mean, the idea of this organizational resilience, which I use here as kind of a euphemism of unspent cash and time that leaves you time to like strategize on critical needs and impact, like that is the concept that with time and money in hand, you can actually do the thing you were talking about, which is the actual impact. So it's moving from those processes, those structures, that, you know, idea of you know, operational, again, organizational resilience, and introducing impact and saying, all right, well, now we have this grantee experience front and center. We built a structure around it. How do we measure this? What do we look like? It's important, qualitative. So you can't even get to the impact if you can't get past this, all the stuff you just talked about. Because yeah, I mean, it's our system of philanthropy, unfortunately, is short-term in nature. We fund short cycles, and we have these complex processes, and we have these like complex result matrices and theories of change, and we're already off track to making the impact because we've spent so much time stuck on the other stuff. So the kind of key is, like you said, it's bringing in best of practice, trusting the grantee, mobilizing on that growth of that collective, and really ultimately meeting as a group, as a collective in the middle. But you know, easier said than done. And I realize I'm preaching and waxing poetic on something that, like, it's not that far away now, but it's a little, you know, it's a little out there. But I think that idea is organizational resiliency, build that through taxonomies, and then you get to the impact stuff, which is the sexy, needy stuff that we all did this for to begin with.
And given the kind of the rise and preponderance of digital technology and access, where do you see some of the intersections on individual philanthropy, individual donations, even digital donations being done, and on the grant making side? Because we've talked about this in a few different mediums, but I think that in this case, it's a really good focal point of the pie might be a little bigger, quote unquote, when it comes to individual donations, but the tone of what is effective and impact is actually set by the foundation world. So how do you see those two clashing or playing well together moving forward?
Right. I mean, I think that the reality is the lens I bring is my experience, which is obviously in legacy donors and new foundations, and I can speak to the merging of those two and all that. But the reality is this whole other host of 70 some odd % of it comes from individuals. And the interesting part about individual donors, they tend to there's a more hyper local focus oftentimes, because that's that's what they see, that's their vantage point.
It's right in front of their nose. Yep.
Right there, which makes sense. So if I'm looking as a foundation, I'm thinking, well, how do I mobilize money and how do I come at this? I take again, not to overuse the Chicago realm, but I take someone like a Forefront who comes in and they say, we have an incredible network of nonprofits, of foundations, and they also are connected to the city of Chicago, and they're taking the public and private and putting them in the same room. And that alone, and saying we have resources that help Chicago and the Cook County and as a state, Illinois, do incredible things. And what it does is it enlists people in things that are close to them, and it tugs on that emotional side of, I need to be able to help the people in the community I know about. And it's not that they're not willing to look elsewhere, it's just that that's the first response that you're always going to come to. So I think hyper-local is a really interesting intersection point. And when you talk about, again, data lakes, data trust, things of that nature, it's starting to say anyone who has an input on this, put it in the middle and let's at least make sense of it, and let's at least build this. And this is where Bright Hive does an incredible job of coming through and offering the idea of, like, can we make a data trust that comes forward and displays out where people are doing good together, and in that make that something that then can be transported out using APIs and other ways to be able to influence the way people work. And the value there is all of a sudden, if you have people on a Neon platform or even like a GoFundMe where it's an individual that's fundraising and you can sync information back and forth through these systems, you start to inform the actual donor who might actually be I mean, oftentimes foundations are pretty risk averse. They have a board, they have specific programs they need to do. The individual has a blanket of things that they might be completely open to and just say, this is everything I'm willing to, and it's just so much, it could be so much bigger, you know, in that sense. So I think you're calling forward basically different risk profiles in giving, and albeit they might be smaller donations, but they span the long tail of where you need to find funding. And I think the more you can make that data available from foundations, from people who are giving in a large amount that have the academic research that says this is what we know has been working, and here are these incredible change makers. And oh, by the way, even more important, here are all the people that we couldn't fund. Think about MacArthur is doing such great work where they said, we have this 100 and change, we funded Sesame Street, and by the way, there were 200 grants that we could have easily given to the same amount and felt just as good, and there's probably 2,000 of those that were even more so available that just couldn't scale with the 100 million. So like, who's funding those? Those should be funneled into a thing to say, these are amazing projects that we believe need to be funded, and as an individual, I highly suggest that you take a look at them. And that's the value of starting to unleash that, and I think that's where you see it. My guess is it has to come through an affiliation like 100 and change, through a hyper-local, oftentimes through community foundations are really going to be the hub there, or something where there's, again, some sort of linkage that brings them into a collective, whether it be an open or closed collective. It's something they affiliate themselves to. Mm-hmm. So affiliations, geographic, hyperlocal, these are ways that I think are the future of what we need to do to get the momentum or continue the momentum we're seeing with a lot of the COVID, and COVID being the most, unfortunately, one of the craziest rally points that we've ever had to deal with, but fortunately making us think differently.
Ultimately, it comes down to what this has done is held up a mirror.
Right.
And asked us to take a very stark look at ourselves. It's about identity. This is very, very much about identity as individuals, in terms of what you're prioritizing, what are your values, mm-hmm. Identity as communities. You know, I'm looking a lot more at data on my county. I'm listening more about things about what my town is doing. I mean, I've
never gone more. I mean, so I live in near Honolulu. I've never, all of a sudden, I'm like on the Honolulu government site all the time. I'm like, I never even had visited up until like this month, and I am all over it now. And it's incredible to see that people that might not have typically looked at it it's the awareness is so high. And
it's fascinating because if you look at it as you go higher and higher, depending on where you are, of course, if there's a cohesive plan and vision going up the chain, then there's a safety element there. I'm in New York, right? Like it's hitting us pretty hard, but if you go all the way up to what Governor Cuomo's been doing, there's been a pretty consistent drumbeat and in terms of what to do that. But then you see that our Republican town supervisor of Niskayuna with only like a small amount of people is like going, okay, so here's the Schenectady County website. Here's what Governor Cuomo said. Here's what's going on here. Here's what, and so when everybody's aligned, what this is showing is that if there's alignment, then there's strength there. And I hope that's what comes through, because people are contributing in so many different ways to this and approaching it in very unique ways that I think there is good. There's a lot of good that we are seeing. But, kind of maybe to wrap things up for us and also for the conference, Kerrin, in 5 years, mm-hmm. where do you want us to be as an industry, not as a human race? Let's narrow it down when it comes to.
I want us to answer. It's a really good question. I think I'm saying this with the right to come up with something way more eloquent, because you did not tell me this was one of the questions. Well, actually,
sorry. You know how I'm
rambling,
off the cuff.
So I reserve the right to be much more intelligent in a future state.
Absolutely.
But I think the conversation needs to evolve now from what does this project, what does this thing unveil for the common good, to how can we mobilize a sector around this good. So it's around the mobilization of the collective. That is the absolute difference. And even as a technologist, we had to create these things and we had to create operations that structured people. But I think the reality is to act as a collective, to bring it together, to mobilize all those pieces. Man, that would be, I mean, that's the way our community works. We're mirroring the culture of who we serve and why we got into this. So the idea of mobilizing the sector around a common good, I mean, there's no greater grail on that, right?
I hope, and to just kind of to augment that, I hope that we can start thinking not as a sprint, but as a marathon.
Right.
I think that's the biggest issue, is even the terminology in the individual fundraising world.
Right.
The annual fund.
Right.
The annual fund. Well, so what if I gave a day after? It's not the same impact that I'm going to have. You know,
Right.
Thinking in fiscal years. Yes, you have to project out budgets and things like that. But the reality is that impact is cyclical.
Mm-hmm.
Feedback loops are cyclical, and that's not going to just stop because you decided artificially that August 1st is when your fiscal year begins.
Right. Well, I agree. And I think I'll say it again, never has our industry been more relevant and more important. And the call for us to be able to help people align, to mobilize the money, to get the services to the people that need it, never has it been more important. So I am warmed to see that the initial reaction of everyone was to say, how do we do this? And I think the reality is there's a lot of moving pieces, process, impact definition, a lot of things that need to happen. And that's something we can definitely explore in a whole nother panel at some point.
We're doing another one of these. Don't worry about it.
I'm inspired for 10 years in at Fluxx. I've never been more inspired of where the industry can go.
I love that. Well, thank you very much, Kerrin. This was an absolute pleasure. We're going to do it, folks. We're going to keep going. I encourage you to continue to dream big. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, cool.